Well, depending on, the distance, angle, even, the light or your mood, what you perceive will be different. Now, the key here is that complex biosignals have been accumulating rapidly, all kinds of data. So a few years ago, we think it's a better one method for analysis would be first accurate, then fast, and then automated. And then we also realized that the best method probably would be a single method that can do all these. So they can quantify the data on different scales simultaneously. So let's see if we can do that. But let me show you an example. So many of you, I think, know this better than me. So this data is from PhysioNet. It's a long, probably 7 hours or 24 hours, I forgot. Now the key here is if you zoom in and extract this part out, you get this. If you zoom in here, you get this. They're very different. Now if you take a Fourier transform, so here you have a peak here, but here it's a log-log scale, you have almost a straight line. So it's called 1/f process, 1/f alpha process. Now in the field, 1/f is considered the best modeling. But in order to get this, the C.K. Peng now at Harvard, originally at Boston University. So he told us that they actually have students to manually pick up all these and throw them away. And then have this model. Now, this doesn't mean this model is not good. The thing is, earlier they could do that. Data are limited, right? But nowadays you have too much data. You can easily, monitor a patient for multiple days, and if you have to find people to zoom in every piece of data to throw them away, it's impossible, right? So the key is non-stationarity. Now, data to be talked about here from two sources. One is PhysioNet, many of you know. Another is from CDC, for the study of chronic fatigue syndrome. Anyone knows this? CFS. Well, briefly, it's something like when one constantly feels, like a fatigue, tired, or irritated, cannot rest well, cannot sleep well, and that's like, And CDC people originally thought that the cardiac functioning of CFS subjects would be very different from normal controls. Now the key here is in a very stressful environment. They think, in normal conditions, those two groups will be similar. But in stressful conditions, they will be very different. It's kind of a good hypothesis, right? But it turns out the opposite is true. Of course, here is the key is the cardiac function, right? So there are a number of prior works. It's like low heart rate variability during sleep, and a small left ventricle, partial tachycardia, short QT interval, abnormal cardiac wall motion, and even low blood volume. So there are some, prior work pointing to that direction. And their test is kind of a truly something. So I think it's around 30 minutes to 1 hour test. And before the test, they, do many things. Like, but during the test, they will do this. So they ask each subject to speak something, and then draw blood, and then again speech, and then do math calculation. And after that, they will draw blood 5 times. All kinds of things. So from another point of view, this data is very, very non-stationary, right? And myself would be like, honestly, I would refuse to participate in this kind of test. Too much blood, too many, blood draws. So, okay, so what I want to talk about are these. the first, can patients with certain cardiac disease be distinguished from normal subjects? And with respect to CFS, we can ask how debilitating is the CFS? And the third one is kind of a long-standing issue. And a few years ago, it seemed to be resolved. And actually, we wrote a paper claiming that cardiac chaos probably wouldn't exist. But turns out from this very, very non-stationary data set, they have appeared. So it's kind of puzzling. OK, so let me focus on the first part, adaptive algorithm for multiscale analysis. The motivation here is that sometimes the background signal can be very strong. And also could be very noisy. But our desired signal, the component can be, very weak. Or like in terms of energy or percentage, it could be only like 5%, 10% of the energy. So are we able to actually set a desired component? So it turns out sometimes yes, not always. Now, this is global warming temperature data. And people know, global warming is true. Now, if you try to fit a global, truly global trend, it's kind of not too flexible, right? So I think the better approach would be to, fit piecewise polynomials and then try to combine them. Now, piecewise polynomials involve, Taylor expansion, Taylor series expansion. So long as, the series is short enough, it can be optimal, right? So the key here is to how to combine them. Turns out that there's a simple solution. So suppose we let, adjacent segments to overlap by half a window. Now, here, of course, nothing to be done. But here, you have two segments. You try to combine them according to some linear weighting scheme, depending on how far away the point is from each center. After you do that, you get this. So this is a global trend, again, global trend, but this is local trend. With only 3 windows, it's already very good. And a few years ago, NASA chief oceanist so they have a paper using, it's called empirical model decomposition to achieve this. And here, so using this method, the residuals would be very similar to theirs. But actually, since our windows, right, can be arbitrary, so the residuals can be even smaller than their method. So here's is an example. So this is inter-beta interval data, but it can be any kind of data. So it's very non-stationary. It's from the CDC stress test. So this is one example. Another example, you can easily determine the trends. But I don't know if this trend is good or bad or should be removed or not. It's a different issue. Now, if we add noise to, chaotic Lorentz data, so the red one is the clean data. The green one is the noisy data, so it's very noisy. Now, if you use something called projective filtering from chaos theory, you get this. It has some effect, right? But not too good. Now, if you use wavelet transform, you get this. It's better than this. Now, this is using our simple method. It's even better. And this calculates, residual noise. So our method is here. So remaining noise is always the lowest. Now, wavelet is also very good. Now, with 3 different thresholding schemes, they're kind of equivalent, but all are, slightly worse than our method. Now, how do we do multiscale decomposition? It's very simple. So we have a parameter called window length, right? Window size. You just introduce a sequence of window sizes. and get the corresponding trend signals. And you just take, the difference between, adjacent trend signals. That's it. Of course, if you sum them together, that's the original signal, right? So next, let me briefly explain what is fractal and multifractal analysis. So many of you know this very well, I believe, because you have been studying dynamical systems for a while. But in case not, you can just think like this. Anything, if its part is similar to another part or to the whole, you can suspect it's already a fractal. Now, of course, mathematically, if you can observe a power relation, which gives you a straight line in a log-log plot, of course, x-axis has to be fairly wide, and that's fractal. Now, of course, if you have many or infinite many power relations, that's multifractal, right? Now, the model for signal processing, the most used model is called fractional Brownian motion. So it's a Gaussian process with mean zero and stationary increments. Its variance grows with time t as a power law. H is called Hurst parameter. Now from here, the power spectral density has to decay again as a power law, with the exponent being 2h minus 2h plus 1. Now in theory, h is between 0 and 1. When it is larger than 1/2, we say the process to have long memory or long range dependence. Now h equals 1/2 is simply the standard Brownian motion. If h is below 1/2, it's called anti-Poisson correlation. So they all have meanings. Now with HRV in normal subjects, this is usually just the case, and this is interpreted as the super stable condition of human heart. But turns out in people with cardiac disease, it's also often true. So those early interpretations, really, you cannot be too serious. Now, to be more precise, we actually have to talk about a two-time series. The one I just talked about is called random walk process. And the easier process is called increment process. So this one is stationary. And its power spectral density decays also as a 1 minus, as a power law with exponent as 2h minus 1. Now here it's 2h plus 1. The reason is, integration differentiation in, the frequency domain gives you f squared. Now if we construct from this time series a new one, it's a simple smoothing, right, scheme. And then, the new variance will scale with, the block size m as another power law. So here, if we choose m to be, h to be 1/2, and m to be 100, then you'll see the variance will drop to be 1%. Now, if h is increased to 3/4, in order for the variance to decay as much, how big should m be? It's very easy to calculate. M will be 10,000. So square of this, much, much greater, right? Now, if h is much smaller, it's only 1/4. Then for the variance to drop as much, your m is only around 21, 22. Now, in the literature, the most celebrated method is called for estimating h is called detraining fluctuation analysis, developed by C.K. Peng and the Eugene Stanley group. It involves to partition data into many equal segments, and then within each segment fit a linear or polynomial, and then try to get the difference between original data and the fitted polynomial within each segment, and then do some kind of average. Now, the problem here is it is a boundary. You may have very large discontinuity. Turns out often this is okay, but when data have very strong cycles or nonlinear trends. And then this can cause very serious problems. But as I showed you, our method can easily determine a global trend, right? And then this problem can be easily solved. So that's what we mean by adaptive fractal analysis. So we just first, get a random walk, and then fit a global trend. And then you just, remove the global trend from data and use this equation to estimate the edge. It's quite simple. Now, if you make exponent here 2 to be arbitrary Q is real, then this is called multifractal formulation. So everything is very simple. Now, sunspot, has a strong 11-year cycle, right? Now, with this data set, DFA will give you an edge, fairly large, around bigger than 1. And this is, incorrect because theoretically edge is in between 0 and 1. Now, using other filtering techniques like a PCA or like SVD and other methods, and this edge can be, decreased around this. So AFA is correct. And this time scale is around half of the cycle, so around 5-6 years. Now here is analysis of the interval data from CDC's stress test. So this is an example of control. This is an example of CFS subjects. There are 2 time scale regions. One, H is larger than 1/2. And we call this H short time scale, and another is long time scale. H is often smaller than 1/2. So in a short period of time, heart is actually, H is not below 1/2. It's just, kind of like, I would say just responding to the test. And some people may, get a nervous or something like that. But very soon they would, come down. So when edge is smaller than 1/2, you could, associate that as something, someone with a calm, mood. Okay, so can we really distinguish between, normal controls and CF subjects? So these 2 are for data measured before the test. These 2 are for during test. So during the test, essentially there's no difference. Of course, this is PDF, right? Probability density function of, HS and HL. So during the test, no difference. But before the test, there is some difference, right? And especially, control is here. HS is slightly, on average, larger than, HS for the CFS subjects. And after the test, the data will be in between these 2, so kind of recovering. So that's what I meant, The result is kind of contrary to what the CDC people had hoped. But it's good. Still, there is a difference, right? Okay, so I'm going to the second part is about chaos theory and SDOE. So first, I will explain one concept, is phase space. So I believe many people know this. But anyway, suppose we have a simple dynamical system, which is characterized by 2, variables, x1 and x2. And in experiments, you would try to measure how x1 and x2 vary with time, right? So you have time series data. Now, what is a phase space? It's simply a space, or plane here, spanned by x1, x2. Now here, time is an implicit parameter. So depending on your initial conditions, you will have different trajectories. So you could associate this as, driving. Of course, Knoxville and this whole area, traffic is very good. But many places like Los Angeles, San Jose, and in China, almost everywhere is terrible, right? Now, suppose you, like in some day with very bad traffic, and you were driving to a friend's home and you get stuck. How would you explain to your friend? Will you tell him that your speed, how, something like this, like a variation of your speed and position with time? It's not. You tell him, where you are, the position, and how fast you're driving, right? So basically, this is the picture. So the next concept I want to explain is transformation. So here are two fishes. So it's by Sir Darcy Thompson. He found that he can always can find a simple plane transformation to transform one kind of fish to another kind. And nowadays, if you Google this Darcy Thompson and this book, Google will tell you, Wikipedia will tell you, this book is a very strong support for Darwin's theory of species, origin of species. But I think you may also know. So Dr. Schaff at University of Arizona, right? And when I was saying this, and he told me this is wrong. Originally, Dr. Thompson was, trying to use this book as a very strong basically against Darwin. But I just don't know, nowadays we think this book is probably provides the best evidence for Darwin's theory. But anyway, so my purpose here is for you to imagine that we may have some kind of transformation that can transform, the eyes, mouth, tail of this fish to, somewhere here and that you cannot recognize. Or something like that, suppose there's a, outside is very windy and you have a piece of paper on your hand and you put some sand on your paper and you step out and drop your paper. Now, can you see or track where the sands go? If you can, you're too good, right? Usually you don't, if it's a very windy day. Now, if you can think like that, it's basically it's the essence of chaotic transformation. But let's take an example. So it's I believe all of you know this, right? It's a realistic map. It's a chaotic one. Now, if you start from this initial condition, you get a trajectory. And if you slightly change the initial condition, you get another one. Of course, the key here is how the small error grows with time, right? And all of you know that it's almost exponential, the growth. This is log here. But of course, eventually it will saturate. The reason is delta x itself is in the unity interval. So so now I would say here's the scope of dynamical systems. So first, it provides a classification of motion. The simplest one is fixed points, and then we have limit cycles and torus, chaos, and turbulence, and even random motion. And limit cycle is just a periodic motion, and you could associate it with a crystal. And the torus basically is a quasi-periodic motion, and you could again associate it with a quasi-crystal. And 3 years ago, Daniel Schachman won the Nobel Prize in chemistry on quasi-crystal, right? But in this sequence, torus is actually is the smallest one. The measure for the parameters to have quasi-periodic motions is kind of the smallest. And that's one of the reasons that the quasi-crystals experimentally are very difficult to find. Now, in early literature, chaos is also called a strange attractor. So both has a meaning. So strange and attract. Attractor means all the trajectories in the phase space are bounded. And strange means nearby trajectories will grow exponentially. So you have exponential stretching, and then the trajectory have to be bounded. So you have stretching and folding back, stretching, folding back. So often you have a fractal. And of course, the classic measures for chaos include 3 of them: the proof exponent, fractal dimension, and the Kolmogorov entropy. Now, in theory, they work, but in practice, they don't. So now, in physical community, the early assumption for chaos is this: so long as you can find by computation a positive, finite positive Lyapunov exponent or Kolmogorov entropy or non-integral fractal dimensions, and you can claim your data as chaotic. And this practice is, still being followed in, some areas of engineering, but no longer in physical community. Now, with this assumption, it's kind of chaos is everywhere, in the brain, in the heart, in weather, is everywhere. Something like, there's a cartoon here. So many people are yelling, here's a beat, another one is echoing, here's another one, or footprint, of the chaos. But after a while, someone is more careful and saying that, okay, this may not be, the footprint of the beast, it's yours. And it turns out, basically, all our human beings, pseudo footprints. Of course, the question is, problem is how to, solve this, or can it be solved? Turns out, yes. So we can use, something called scale-dependent Lyapunov exponent. So Lyapunov exponent is a number, but scale-dependent is a function that depends on a continuous parameter scale. So here's the definition. So we consider an ensemble of trajectories. Now suppose, initially the separation between those trajectories is very small, is epsilon 0, and after time t, their average separation is epsilon t. And at a time t plus delta t, their average separation. Now it's the average. Using average, then I can, have nice properties like continuous or even differentiability. Now, so long as delta t is very small, I can always write it like this. There's no assumption here. So epsilon t plus delta t equals epsilon t times an exponential function. Now, this equation would become a differential equation in the, when t goes to 0, right? And this is lambda epsilon is the scale, so lambda epsilon is SDOE. So definition is very simple, right? So computational is also very simple. So suppose we have a scalar time series. You just use this procedure to construct a vector. It's called time delay embedding. So M is the embedding dimension and L delay time. And of course, M and L have to be chosen according to some kind of criterion. Now, after all those are done, so we can introduce a sequence of shells. It's a kind of conditional probability. By shell, I mean, so the distance between two vectors is, larger than something but smaller than something else, right? The shell. And then SDOE is simply given by this equation. And here, this angle brackets is just a sample average. It's very simple, right? Now, of course, if your data is truly chaotic, you have to add this condition to remove something called tangential motion, in the sense that if two cars are driving in the same lane, then you don't observe chaotic motions, because one is following the other, right? Now, I have to emphasize that so LE is this, right? Using logistic map, so I explained to you. And when lambda 1 is positive, then we can claim this is chaotic. Now, SDOE is simply this. But we don't assume that epsilon t plus delta t is to be larger than epsilon t. It actually can be shrinking. And in the field, there's another concept called finite size Lyapunov exponent. Now, that one, they have to require that epsilon t monotonically increase with time. But that condition is not needed here. So the definition is simple, but it turns out we can do a lot. So we can analytically prove that for deterministic chaos, SDOE is a constant. Does not depend on the scale epsilon. Now for noisy chaos and noise-induced chaos, on very short time phase space scales, we have this scaling. Now gamma is positive. So here epsilon is very small, right? Now if we let epsilon go to 0, then this one goes to infinity. And this is good because theoretically any kind of noisy system, its entropy have to be infinite. So this is given by this scaling law. And also we can analytically determine that gamma determines the speed of loss of information, and it is related to the coarse-grained information dimension of the data set. Now also for random 1/f processes, we have a power law scaling. And for alpha stable Levet processes, we have another power law scaling. And for stochastic oscillations, depending on the embedding parameters here, right? We have M and L. Depending on the embedding parameters, we can have both scalings, this one or this one. And for some motions that with multiple scaling behaviors, such as like chaos on very short time scale parameters, but diffusion or fractal on larger scales, you do have both. So basically, anything that can automatically give you the scaling behaviors and the scaling regions. So now, of course, with all these analytic relations, and also with they can be easily verified by simulations, and the issue of distinguishing chaos from noise is no longer a problem, right? Now, the scheme also have some other nice properties. Suppose I have a pure 1/f process. Now then I just perturb it to give it some kind of noise. Say either simply add some noise or some orthogonal signal to it, or break it down into many pieces, and in the middle insert those kind of noises. And can we still find the correct edge? Turns out yes. Now if your perturbing signal is sinusoidal, then you only perturb SDOE curves on large scales here. But on small scales, they are intact. Edge is still the same. And this kind of corresponds to the first picture I showed you, right? HRV data, and some segments you have a peak, some other segments you have a nice 1/f process, a straight line, right? Now with this, yes, then you don't have to manually pick up those segments. And a few years ago, Professor Leon Glass at McGill, right? He had a special issue in chaos, and someone told us, and we wrote a paper. And the first review was actually done by Professor Glass, and he demanded us to work on this intermittent chaos. So this, from a logistic map, but with certain parameter. Most of the time, the motion is periodic, but it can switch to chaotic briefly, and then switch back to chaos. And he saw that it was impossible to detect chaos here. And of course, that time we also didn't know, right? So we tried. Turns out it's very easy. So SDOE, we do have a plateau here. It's a constant. Now, it's a log scale, right? So it's this over, the scale range over order of magnitude. Now, actually, this thing is, in essence, this result is not surprising. This is very similar to this one. So I have a fractal signal, and I, break it down randomly into many different pieces, and in the middle insert, periodic signals. It's really very similar to this, right? So both the fractal and chaotic features are preserved by, those kind of perturbations. So now let me go back to HRV data. So it turns out for healthy subjects, we have a nice scaling. So it's minus gamma log epsilon. But for people with congestive heart failure, it's like this. The pattern is this. It's much worse. And from these two, we can define two parameters we call feature here, feature 1, feature 2, and we can perfectly, distinguish, one group from another. So figuring out who is healthy, who is not, is kind of not difficult. And in the literature, now there's a Nature paper by Professor Union Standards Group, and another, late paper. And they really don't work with all 15, CHF data sets. They only work with 12 of them. Otherwise, they don't have such nice separations. But here, we really don't have to care about it. We just use all the data sets and the separation, feature 1. Now, this is called ROC curve, right? Receiver operating characteristic curve. And feature 1 is almost perfect. Feature 2 is just perfect. So it's better than those methods. Now, yesterday, downstairs, we have had some people and chatting with, how this workshop could be useful for clinical people. And then Stephen from Zoe were educating us, and I just added this figure. So this one's saying that for normal subjects, we often have this, nice scaling behavior. But for AF, atrial fibrillation data, now here, basically, if we just zoom in, not to use, such, fine scales, this is basically, just a point, right? It's 10 to minus 0.4845, just a single point. So for AF people, basically just a single point. Single point is very similar to, from purely independent random noise. And in the literature, AF people or AF data are considered to be the least complex, in the sense that they don't have nice property like H to be smaller than 1/2 or something like that. But I would say that kind of interpretation is confusing. And now here, so in terms of SDOE, if you can resolve, this is a kind of dynamics. Resolve small-scale dynamics, then you can say the dimension is kind of smaller. But here you cannot resolve anything, so you have to conclude that the dimension for AF people is very high. Yes? Complexities, there are many, ways to define that. But one way is called, less random. Fully random, people will think it's just not complex. No, okay, let me say it this way. So, okay, let me put it this way. So, do you know entropy? So, now one scheme would say less complexity means, smaller entropy. But this is like a deterministic complexity measure. And another is called, I think, a statistical one. So it's like in the middle. Something regular is not a complex. Something free random, not a complex. Something in the middle, most complex. So that's called a statistical complexity. But here, so they probably are thinking like this. But so far, there's no, very, like a generally accepted measure for statistical complexity has been proposed. So such measure has not been, there. So in that sense, complexity, you could often associate with an entropy. Now, in that case, then, AF people, AF data, they have to be most complex. It's most random, right? But here, I think from the viewpoint of dimension, it's better. So for AF people, their heart is kind of, less coherent. It's something like it's loosened. So you have to use, higher dimensions to describe that. Now, I would say this may be useful for modern people. But yesterday, Stephen also mentioned that maybe, we could further check that from data, like from ECG data. I told him that for this analysis, we only had HIV data. We didn't have ECG data. So we could do both. First from data, then, if I would say this is correct, and if it's truly correct, then, to figure out how this would be used by modern people, right? Okay, so the last two. So does cardiac chaos exist or not? The answer is yes. So I mentioned that a few years ago we wrote a paper claiming that cardiac chaos didn't exist. And that was with Professor Glass's special issue. Now, from those data, we didn't. But with CDC's data, we have these plots. So there's a plateau. Now, you could argue that this plateau, its value is almost zero, so it may not be significant. But from here, it's clear, it's a log scale, so it's linear, right? Except this time is large, so this one, the slope is small, so here the value is small. But this linear divergence is definite, right? And about 1/3 of the normal subjects have this behavior. Now we have 42 of them. So it's about 15 data sets here. And also with chronic fatigue syndrome people. Again, we observe this. So now we have to conclude that cardiac chaos does exist, but probably in very non-stationary conditions. But I don't know, how broad this could be true. Maybe in other situations, just the data we have are quite limited, right? So the last one, also, inspired by our discussion yesterday afternoon. So suppose we have a long-time series, like a continuous measure in some like a hospital or in some laboratory, and now how do we detect if there are state transitions? Now I don't have those data, so I just use an analogy. So this is a data set from this simple model, but here the parameter A continuously varies with time. And now, if you make an to vary with n, then with one single, initial condition, you get this picture. It's like all the publications are here already. And there's some other measure which I don't have time to explain in detail now. It's called recurrence time. It's kind of related to period. If your signal is periodic, and you get this. So all the bifurcations can be easily detected, and also with the correct value for the periods. Period 2 here, period 4 here. So this could be done, but I don't have data, and just showing some analogy. So maybe this is useful, right? So okay, so I'm done. So I tried to explain two different kinds of methods for multiscale analysis, and also the last few two slides I showed you that cardiac chaos, in the strict sense of exponential divergence of small disturbances, does exist, but probably in very non-stationary situations. And now I don't know whether cardiac chaos is good or bad. This is a further issue, and could be interesting. Maybe people with chaos, are they healthier or less healthy? Now, I have to emphasize that these two plots are the first example of truly exponential divergence in cardiac data. Earlier, there's no such data. So now this issue is a genuine issue, right? And about the CFS, so I showed you that during the test, there's no difference. But before the test, there is some appreciable difference between normal group and CFS subjects, right? And in some sense, I think this is a good observation, and also enhances the mystery encircling CFS people. They always feel like lack of energy or those, but if you do ask them to do something, they can. Okay, so now if you are interested in the methods, actually you don't have to read them. You can just contact me, and I'll give you the codes for analysis. And you can either go there, or the first NIMBioS give you a handout with my emails there, right? You can just contact me. And but finally, let me briefly thank a few of my collaborators. So Jing Hu is my former student now in California, and Brian and Jing Man, they're with CDC. And my friend also California, and some other people in China. And my main purpose here, before I came here, I didn't check what's the main theme of this workshop. But hopefully, some people, I can find some good collaborators here. So thank you.